Hello, book babes.
Hello.
Welcome to episode 24 of the Book Boys
24,
podcast.
24.
Thank you for the echo. Where today we are going to indulge in a very, how should I put this? A very bad book. To put my opinion out there right away. We read Richard Wolff's Democracy at Work. Little pun in the title. Haha.
A Cure for Capitalism.
Yes, that's the subtitle. So, do you want to... Wait, should we just crack our drinks?
Yeah.
I'm already... Alright, we got some alcohol to get us through this.
I've got a bottle of Cava, which I got from my... in fact, never mind.
Careful now with the adjectives, Nick.
Okay, I'm popping this. Oh, I didn't pop.
Oh,
never mind.
I'm cracking my can.
There we go. You can hear the glug.
There you go. And the glug.
Damn. It's going to be like an ASMR podcast soon enough.
On the potato mic. Okay.
All right, cheers.
Cheers.
So, Democracy at Work is quite a short book by Richard Wolff. I think it was published a couple years ago, like fairly recently. Oh, 2012. And the whole idea is introducing this idea of worker self-directed enterprises, which are a kind of workplace democracy, and specifically as a cure, he describes it, to the current situation of like stakeholder capitalism. I guess mainly in America, but also applicable elsewhere.
Yeah, and so as a little background, why the hell would you read this book? So the reason why we ended up reading
I
this
thought
book
it was
is...
interesting. I mean, I've always found workplace democracy an interesting idea, or always, but for a couple of years I thought it was kind of interesting. So
sure,
it's good to hear someone articulate it in some kind of way.
It's just out of the infinity of books you could read. Why did we read this one? So we've read some more like libertarian-minded things recently, especially with The Fountainhead, and so we wanted to go all the other way of the spectrum and see like, obviously Richard Wolff is not like an accomplished academic, not that means anything, but he is definitely online kind of championed as the socialist who's different,
My introduction to Wolff was like a good couple of years ago now, and I think he was quite popular on YouTube for like his lectures about Marxism and stuff like that, introduction to Marxism. And I found them like generally quite, at least as a means of understanding what Marxism is. He's a decent orator, I think, but
I would heavily disagree.
I think he's got this kind of populist twinge that gives a lot of like... I don't say good orator in like necessarily like a good meaning of the word. I think he's kind of...
He gives good oral.
But I will also say like just to start this out, like even though he's kind of considered one of the bigger faces in like the leftist, especially like online and contemporary like publisher like authors, he is
literally he's one of the bigger face. Like this guy has a big face and body.
But he is. I've also come across a huge amount of dislike for this guy, even amongst like leftists online, for sure. And
so
he's definitely not like universally loved in the left at all.
No, for sure. And well, we're gonna get into the nitty gritty of all the argument in a second here. So that's a bit of background on Richard Wolff. He talks a bit like what's that guy who dropped out of the Republican race this year? The guy from Jersey, the fat guy.
I have no idea.
Oh God, I can't remember. Chris Christie. He talks like Chris Christie,
Okay.
and he looks like Chris Christie as well. But yeah, I don't know. Is he? He must be from the East Coast. I don't know if he is, but the way he talks, it just feels so. Yeah.
I'll search it up now. He
Anyway.
he has this very kind of like condescending tone when he talks.
Oh yes. Oh
and,
yes.
He is not a very good debater, and he tends to always use this kind of like might over everything else when it comes to trying to win in debates, which I find really annoying.
And also, if you don't agree with him, it's just because you just don't get it.
Yeah. He does that a lot.
But so anyway, yeah, that's about the book. Should we I have so many quotes written down, and it might be probably good if we just go through it chronologically, but do you have any background or like summary you want to give before that?
I mean, I'll just say like the book is it's pretty short. Like you could probably read it in about 5 hours, 5 or 6 hours maybe. If you were very much rushing through it, like I definitely wasn't.
Yeah, it took me a long time just because I had to like diffuse all the bullshit.
But he begins by defining this problem of capitalism and describing this history of capitalism, especially in the United States. He identifies these contradictions he defines in capitalism, and then he gives this idea of worker cooperatives, or I guess specifically worker self-directed enterprises as a solution to this situation. And then he kind of goes through different questions about the internal running of them and how they might connect to other parts of society, and what kind of conditions would be important in order to introduce these self-directed enterprises. So it's very simply like one thing that is, I think, good about the book is that it feels very much like it was made to be simple to understand, even though I think that actually works in its detriment. The audience, I think, is much more. I don't think like a capitalist reading this book would be convinced by anything.
No, and I mean, even from like he's an academic, but yeah, it is written to be like simply understand for the populace, I guess, but it's kind of rough when you're an academic and you're trying, and this is like considered his like big magnum opus kind of work, right? Like this is his. If he's on a podcast, he will always reference this book. But there is no evidence, no data, pretty much no citations in the whole book.
Yeah.
There is like an eventual footnote every now and then, which usually like links back to his own article that he wrote.
Yeah, I found
so.
It's
that's a bit rough.
I think that's like one of the biggest problems with the way that it's written, because it writes with a lot of authority, but.
Yes, and I generally don't have a problem with that if you're making a theoretical argument, which he is to some extent. But he's also making a lot of like real world data claims without just linking the data. Which
is for sure.
Like if you just want to make like a theory, an economic theory, I don't think you need data. But when you're constantly smashing like. In this year, unemployment was so high because this and that, and if you're making those kind of claims, then you do kind of need evidence, don't you?
For sure. And I think there are like obvious ways of managing that while still making the book easy to approach. Like you can have a very in-depth footnote section, or an endnote section.
Yeah, you don't need like Chicago-style inline citation.
Yeah, exactly.
You can have like a section at the end of the book with all this.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So, going going just from the introduction of the book, the first thing I wrote down is on page 5. I hope these page numbers will be the same for both of us.
Let's see.
They might not. I don't know if we have the same version.
Page 5.
So
no. Page 6 is
No?
the introduction for me.
Oh, okay, so we are a bit out of sync.
I think it would be better
okay,
if,
whatever.
if you just read the sections.
Yeah, I have a lot of quotes, so
Yeah.
it kind of opens up like this book being the cure for the problems of capitalism, and that capitalism does not meet most people's needs. That's a claim. And here's a direct quote, which is, "Production works best when performed by a community that collectively and democratically designs and carries out shared labor." So, I mean, that's just like one of those things where production, what is this? Production works best when it's performed by a community collectively and democratic. Like, this is just not a thing, right? Like, I get he's making this case for worker what is it? WDSD, self design. I don't even know what.
WSDEs, worker self-directed enterprises.
That's it. Where like all the workers are democratically deciding everything about the company, and they all have an equal share of ownership in the company and everything. But
yeah,
to just come out just like in the intro of the book and say, so capitalism is a complete failure, although we're all rich now and it's better than in history than it's ever been. And actually the best way to produce things is this thing that I'm proposing that's never been done.
Yeah.
But it's the best one. And it's like, okay.
Yeah. I think we should first try and we should probably give a definition of what exactly a worker self-directed enterprise is before we get too much into this.
Yeah, so let me skip to that part in the book then, because that's another frustration, because he actually puts the actual idea of the book is like a 1-page worth of stuff that's very late in the book.
Yeah.
So
I guess where we can begin from is like, in a typical like Marxian analysis of a company or any kind of like working relationship, there's the owner, the capitalist, and then there's the producers or the workers.
Mm-hmm.
And because these people have contradictory interests, this can lead to exploitation of workers. And he also brings up this idea, the surplus labor idea from Marx. So in order to remedy this, he says that the director of the company and the producer, the person who produces the value of the company or the goods of the company, should be the same people. And everyone involved in the running of the business should also be producing what the business produces. And this is what self-directed enterprises are. And, this has like, there are different ways that this has kind of manifested in history. He has a whole section dedicated to the difference between his concept and other previously existing concepts, like, for example, co-ops, like farming co-ops, for example, and shared ownership with from employees. So, for example, in the UK, I don't know if I'm not sure exactly. We have like a nationalized post service. Actually, this is not really a very good example because they were already nationalized. But at some point, employees were I think they were gifted shares in the company. So people who are employees.
This is something Wolff also pushes.
Yeah. He describes differences between co-ops and other things to this self-directed enterprise idea. To be honest, I kind of felt like, especially in the last section, things got pretty muddy, and you kind of just let anything fly. But we can talk about that later. The fundamental thing is that workers have the ability to direct the way that their company goes, and this is a new kind of responsibility that workers will receive. He made a kind of comparison to the freedom of slaves in America, which I thought was kind of obtuse, but
what's the comparison? Can you?
Yeah, I was just going to explain. He describes the freeing these slaves in America was not a move that was like designed to necessarily make the lives of enslaved people immediately better after becoming free, but more was like motivated by a belief that freedom was important, and that people who were freed didn't necessarily have amazing lives immediately after, but the bottom line was that they became more self-responsible. They were given more responsibility over themselves because of their new freedom. And the same is kind of true if you were in a situation like this. If you turn up at your shift every day and you just have to make coffee or whatever, and you go home and you don't have to think about work, that's one situation. But he kind of argues that like it's necessarily a good thing that you would have involvement in that company that you work for, even if you're just making coffee. And even though it's not necessarily like always a great feeling that, okay, now I have to actually be responsible for this company, he believes that it's a better idea. It's a better solution than what we currently have.
This is the thing, though. He also, while he does not just go along with the prevailing notion of communism, as in like, Stalinism, he does copy a lot of like stuff from Marx's Capital one by one.
Yeah.
And one of those things is the definition between the productive workers and the unproductive workers.
Yeah.
Or as he calls them, what was it? The productive workers and the enablers or something like that. So in your example, the person just making coffee,
you should
they wouldn't actually
tell people
have
what those
any
roles are
ownership
as
in
well.
the company. Yeah, they wouldn't actually have any ownership in the company because they're not productive. They would have a probably parliamentary representation kind of influence in the board of directors, but they wouldn't have ownership of the company.
Wait, hang on. So firstly, the enablers, the difference that he describes between producers and enablers are: producers are the people that construct the thing that creates value to be sold, right? So if you're in like your pin making factory or whatever, you're the guy on the line who's doing stuff to make this product exist, physically producing something. And I mean, it could be software, it could be some other kind of service, I guess, but he describes the enablers as the people that facilitate the conditions for that work to be completed, right? So they're managers, or they're cleaners, or they're the lawyers that help them in, legal situations and stuff like that, right? They don't contribute to the direct production of a product, but they kind of assist or enable that, right?
Yeah.
So the people producing coffee would be producers, right? They wouldn't be enablers.
See, and that's another problem with this distinction, that it's just nonsensical. Because depending on how you can twist it, like if you're a company that makes steel pipes and you're a secretary who is every now and then makes coffee, like you're not producing the steel pipes, you're an enabler. But again, as you just said, you could say that she's making the coffee, so is she really a producer?
No. if they're selling coffees, then yeah, she would be a producer. But if she's
if they're selling coffees,
if she's making coffee to help the staff work better, then that would be enabling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's another problem with this distinction. You could essentially do the same task, but depending where you work, you would be a producer or an enabler.
Oh, okay, sure. I see what you're saying with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't really get why that was a necessary distinction to make.
I don't. Well, I think it comes down to his claim is that the big. Okay, I think we have to go chronologically because none of this will make sense.
Sure.
Because we have to first talk about his analysis of socialism in the 20th century.
I'll leave all that to you because I have.
And then.
I don't think I'm equipped at all to talk about economic arguments.
Okay. Well, it's not all economics, but
Sure.
yeah. Well, let's just go chronologically, and then keep in mind the puzzle we just threw out there and now abandoned, and then we're going to come back to it.
Probably.
Okay. So, going back to page 5, another thing he just puts out there right at the beginning is the particular versions of anti-capitalism, the various forms of state socialism and communism that actually prevailed over the last century no longer seem to offer a model or inspiration to those looking for an alternative to capitalism. So even though it's worded a bit diplomatic, if we want to get, first off, he does say that he's not for Stalinism or Maoism. So that's kind of okay. We can go somewhere with this, you know. So yeah, just putting that out there first. Then the next kind of thing he establishes is that capitalism is at fault for the 2008 crisis.
Right.
And yeah, so then he kind of like goes into the recent history of economic crises, mostly focusing on 2008, and explaining why capitalism has failed, from which then he derives this need to change capital or to overcome capitalism, very similar to Marx in a way. Although I guess with Marx it's more like the conditions in the factory are bad, and now this guy's like unemployment goes to 12% every now and then.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm quoting again from page 11 in my version.
Okay.
Large and direct government assistance for business and the rich is supposed to, quote-unquote, trickle down and provide a recovery for the mass of people. However, the trickle-down economics program hasn't worked. So he makes a criticism of this, you know, what he just said, giving subsidies and tax exemptions to rich and big businesses, and saying that this kind of trickle-down stuff doesn't work. The big thing I would say about this is that if you actually come on the side of, and I'm not talking about like modern, like Joe Biden type Democrats, but if you're talking to actual capitalists, actual like especially in the economics field, if you're talking to anyone on obviously the Austrian school, but you don't even have to go that extreme. Even like people like Peter Schiff. I don't know if you know Peter Schiff. He's in the news a lot, but
no,
like,
I'm not familiar.
You know, the big people who are like championing free markets, free enterprise. You will find no one who's more against these kind of policies. Like subsidies for business, like giving tax benefit, giving taxpayer money to businesses, crony capitalism. That his whole characterization of capitalism is this perversion where government already works together with business. And this never changes throughout the whole book, where like he keeps criticizing capitalism, but his description of capitalism is this like unholy alliance between particular businesses cooperate, like essentially the mercantilism that Adam Smith in 1776 already criticized. which is kind of where we get this original capitalist movement from, which is that we want to move away from mercantilism. We want to move away from the partnership between government and
Cronyism,
companies.
right?
Yeah, cronyism.
Yeah.
We want to work. We want to move away from that towards a completely free market.
Yeah.
And I think in that it is really that sense that most people understand capitalism.
Yeah, and to just give like a brief point, and I won't go on this too long because this is kind of later in the book, but it is kind of ironic that his, this whole this baseline criticism of him of this like kind of cronyism and alliance of government and capital is then what he advocates for in his final chapter when it comes to implementing these self-directed enterprises. He didn't go as far, and I was worried that he would go as far to say that like there should be some state mandate for this or whatever. He didn't really go as far as that, but it just kind of boiled down to the same old shit that everyone talks about, which is like we need to have better laws for this. We need to encourage this. We need to educate people about this. It's like you read like any Japanese like social science paper. I don't know why it's like a really common, seems to be a really common trend in like some Japanese academia where it's just like they'll talk about something for 20 pages or whatever, and at the end they're like, yeah, so it would be nice if we like did this and this and this, and it's always the same kind of solutions, like people need to be educated on this and we need to give subsidies for this and whatever. And it's not, I don't see how that's like any different to this original idea that he's criticizing. It's just him saying this, I believe this is better, and so that's why I believe that my solution deserves this special treatment, which is like, okay, everyone says that. So
to go to another part from page 11 to that point, and I quote, "The political and economic establishment simply repeats its usual mainstream mantra, maintaining the post-2007 trickle-down program with maximum hype about the government's effort to end the crisis and wait until the crisis depresses wages and the costs of doing business enough that profit opportunities prompt capitalists to resume investing." So to just take, what is he saying there? The government is fucking it up, right? The government doing this trickle-down, putting money to big businesses. Government intervention bad, basically. Next sentence. "The establishment prefers to wait rather than to pay the costs of a government intervention sufficient to overcome the crisis. Capitalism, it insists, will eventually produce an economic upturn." So wait, more government intervention? You read this and you think,
more government intervention.
Right, so you read this and you're like, okay, so he's against trickle-down economics. And then he says, oh, they just don't have the balls to do the real intervention.
Yeah.
It's sufficient to overcome the crisis. Okay, so now I have this question. Okay, so what, in his view, would be a sufficient intervention? And now we're working toward that, I guess.
Yeah.
Then the next point is that, and I actually was kind of happy when I read this, is that he's not a Keynesian.
Yes, yeah.
So John Maynard Keynes, from 1936, he published his General Theory of Economics, which kind of overthrew the Austrian school view of the business cycle, and not because it was refuted or anything, just because it wasn't popular anymore. And I think there are a lot of incentives for people in government and academia to be Keynesians. That's a different topic to talk about, but big Keynesian revolution in 1936, and I think although now I guess we're in like post-Keynesianism, ever since 1936, we've really been in a situation where all the mainstream views in government, on the news, in academia, in your school, in your university, everything you're getting is Keynesianism.
Yeah.
You're not getting any different views. But he is against that, and so to quote, "An alternative, though predictable and inadequate program, has come from the still small but growing coterie," I don't even know this word, "of Keynesians. They have been reinvigorated by this crisis, much as John Maynard Keynes' intervention. Their inspiration was produced by the 1930s crisis. They want a much bigger government, fiscal stimulus paid for by bigger temporary budget deficits. They insist that the rising national debt can easily be offset later, once robust economic growth resumes. They are quite confident that a bigger stimulus will solve what they see as the problem, returning to a normal capitalism from a crisis-ridden capitalism. So that's just the Keynesian view kind of summed up. And I think that the chance that this is what you were taught in high school is like 99%. So that there is some kind of business cycle that's endemic to capitalism, and that in economic upswings, the government should curb spending, and in economic downturns, the government should keep spending, increase the deficit, and so on. And this is known as counter-cyclical policy. So he says he doesn't like that, which now there's like another question mark. So what does he want, right?
Yeah.
So going to page 12, quote, because massive government borrowing helped to pay for those policies, national deficits and debt rose quickly. Now both political parties bicker over the details of austerity to reduce those deficits and that debt. They debate larger versus smaller cutbacks in public services and public employment.
Yeah.
So there's another question mark. So Richard Wolff does not like when we cut back on public services and public employment. But he's also against the Keynesian kind of debt-driven government spending, which I don't know. Does he understand that government services and government programs create the debt? Is that like... I'm just so confused. They must suffer austerity cutbacks just when they urgently need more and better government services. What do you mean they need more and better government services? It's those services creating the debt.
According to his own criticism of Keynes.
Yeah. I'm like, what? So, do you have any take on this? Like, did you...
Not really. I mean, this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. Like, you know, I don't know how his criticism of Keynes or state capitalism, or like, you know, government spending. I don't know how he. I don't quite understand how he, you know, confronts that with his proposed idea.
Yeah, he does. That's another thing. It's the whole WSED.
SWSDE. That's another thing as well.
WSDE.
This is not catchy. It's not sexy.
No, it's not sexy. That whole concept, it doesn't actually address, as far as I can tell, this like apparent cyclical problem that capitalism has, according to Richard Wolff. So yeah, on page 15 we get a first taste of Richard Wolff's great idea.
Especially as well, just before you go into that, but especially as well because he also leaves the question open for central planning and market mechanisms when it comes to like distributing products. And like he kind of waves it off a bit. He also claims that like central planning is as good as market planning, which I mean, I'm not an economist, but like
you don't need to. You know, just need to have half a brain to know that that's
I feel like you can kind of talk through that, but you know, it's like that's like a huge aspect of this. I feel right, like
yeah.
And it's kind of
well, he says that his concept WSDEs. I'm just gonna call it that, even if it's not that WSDEs. That they can manifest in both free markets as well as central planning.
Yes.
And so he says like this whole debate about markets and versus central planning, about free enterprise versus state design.
Yeah.
That's completely beside the point in the whole debate, he
Yeah,
says.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's really about who owns the means of production, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it's not beside the point because the data is in, and on the one hand, you have the most prosperous like societies in the world, and on the other hand, you have people literally starving in the hundreds of millions, so or tens of millions.
Yeah.
So I don't know how he gets this idea like that it's beside the point. Like that is literally the point.
And there are other things as well, like, you know, he criticizes lobbying as, and I'm like, I don't know if there's a solution to lobbying, but I feel like, you know, insofar as he brings up lobbying and he talks about the way that, like, you know, corporate interests undermine democracy, right? And
Yeah,
he
yeah.
says that one of the reasons that America is so fucked today is because of things like lobbying, where, you know, powerful companies can lobby the government to have favorable policies enacted for them at the expense of, you know, people and smaller businesses, and to kind of concentrate their power. And he's like very, you know, he's like, the criticism here is obvious at the beginning. You know, he's very like, you know, this is clearly a bad thing. But then later on, it's page 127 for me. He's talking about like the internal construction of like the boards, and he talks
Yeah.
about them lobbying the government.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah,
like,
yeah,
what?
yeah.
So now we have this separate. Now we just, okay, we can just live in this new world with this new ideology or like logic, which is informed by, you know, corporate interests, even though they are, you know, slightly more public in some ways.
No, it's Nick. It's gonna work because we got rid of the bad people. We got rid of the kulaks. So it's all the bad people are not in charge anymore. It's the good people in charge now. So that's why now lobbying it works.
I can kind of understand if he's talking about, like, you know, in terms of just competing in this sphere of lobbying, right? If you're talking about, like, you know, if you're just taking a pragmatic look and being like, okay, there will be lobbyists on the pure capitalist side who aren't interested in these like cooperative businesses. Therefore, we need to strategically lobby in, you know, battling against them. If he like,
Yeah.
you know, didn't make such a fuss about lobbying in the beginning of the book, but kind of acknowledged it as something necessary in this fight for something that he thought was important, then, you know, I wouldn't agree with it, but I get where he's going. But here it's just like, there's no, I feel like if you spoke to him about this and you raised this point, and I'm saying this partly because I've seen so many, you know, debates and interviews with him, you know, he would just like laugh it off, you know, and I feel like some of this book, a lot of this book, I find it kind of hard to take him like seriously, or hard to really trust him as a writer. I think that's like probably one of the biggest downsides of this whole thing.
I was reading, you know, throughout the book, he comes back to often like criticizing government and big business colluding and giving benefits to these big companies and all this like trickle down stuff, and how the corporate greed and government is in like an unholy alliance and all this, how it poisons democracy. And then I thought about what happened during COVID, and I thought, okay, so there's absolutely no way that this guy is above his own fucking party ideology.
Right.
So I looked at his YouTube channel, and fair enough, during COVID, like I looked at a couple of his videos, and he's like constantly like, everyone has to mask, everyone has to get the vaccine, Pfizer is literally God.
Yeah.
And it's people on the right, and especially you know, on the right you have like more like Christian conservative ideology people, but if you look at people like Vivek Ramaswamy, who is the capitalist free enterprise champion on the right, he literally the opposite of that, who is against colluding government and big business towards free enterprise, like no bailouts, no handout, none of this shit. And it is Richard Wolff who is telling us to, like, the biggest transfer of wealth in human history was from taxpayers to pharmaceutical companies during the COVID crisis. So, like, all this shit, all this, you know, all these ideas completely break down when it comes to actual party politics, in the field.
Right.
Like all of a sudden, it's giving money to big business is great. Anyways,
I see what you're saying.
Okay, moving on.
Yes.
So Wolff's great idea is proposed in my version on page 15, which is workers take a greater share or equal share in the company's ownership and management. And so the first two questions that pop up in my mind are, what evidence is there for this system being more productive? And after reading the whole book, there's none. And the second point is, how do we get there? And this is, I think, the biggest criticism of mine, is how do we get there? And how do we ensure just that it wouldn't just that it would be any different, right, from where we are now.
Right.
So the point is that right now you're free to do whatever the fuck you want. If you want to create a WSDE right now,
Yeah.
I'm definitely getting the acronym wrong.
No, that was actually right. If you that's correct.
Okay.
Probably
if you want to make a
got it right.
If you want to make a WSDE right now in Richard Wolff style, you can absolutely do that. No one is stopping. You can literally do that right now. If you have a company right now, or if you want to start a company and you want to make a WSDE, go ahead. Like, no one is stopping you. It's legal.
Yeah.
Go ahead. But it turns out no one is doing that.
Yeah.
And the reason seems to be because it doesn't fucking work. It doesn't produce well, and it's just not a workable system. So, in order to instantiate the system that he's calling for, that is quote unquote more productive, and the fact that in a free system people aren't already doing that indicates that the only way to actually get to Richard Wolff's system is to have the government to force everyone to do it, right? Like, I just don't see a road here where it doesn't end in government totalitarianism.
Well,
how are you gonna?
In all fairness, his suggestion doesn't go as far to say that this should be mandated. It's like.
Well, he never says that explicitly, but I don't think that that's to his credit, because he just kind of leaves this up in the air.
Yeah.
When the blatant evidence is that people don't do this of their own volition, but he still says that we have to do this. So what's the implication there?
Yeah. Well, sure, for sure. I think the way that he presents it is more of like a slightly longer term battle to shift awareness and culture about the possibilities of work. And I think that's what that's idea of the book is.
That's almost funnier, because it's like Richard Wolff, the enlightened from the mountain coming down, never worked a real job in his whole life, always suckling on the government's teeth, coming to educate all these CEOs of like, here's how to make your business more productive. Actually, if you have a huge bureaucracy of democracy in your workplace, and everyone and the janitors can decide on how to like increase your car exports, now you're going to increase production. Like,
well, he also says at the end of the book that I don't know I can't remember his claims, like explicit claims at the beginning, but he does kind of like he says that it's less about being more productive necessarily. He says that I think in the end of the book he says that it might be more productive, which might be like a retraction for what he was saying in the beginning. I can't remember the introduction, but he makes the claim that it's essentially more like I don't know what the best word to use is, because I don't want to mischaracterize what he says, but
I think
the democratic system that involves people that involves everyone will produce beneficial effects to people themselves rather than just the capitalist class, right? That's
right.
I think what the idea is. So it's not necessarily about it having a more prosperous society, but it's more about finding a solution which is like.
Well, the biggest point is that he wants to overcome the business cycle, which he claims is endemic to capitalism.
Right.
And he spends like over half the book talking about that. So it's like he doesn't really tie it back to that in the end.
No.
But that is from the outset of the book. That's the whole push. It's like capitalism has this business cycle. Here it has depressions and crashes, and the only way to fix that, the only way to cure that, is this new system.
But I think also, so going back to your what you were saying about, if this, if CEOs have figured out that this is the best way of doing business, they would have done it already. And whilst I think what he says in response to that is that, of course, the CEOs wouldn't do it because it's against their interests, right?
Right.
Of course,
but
like
I mean, anyone could do it if you're an entrepreneur. If you're starting a business.
No, I know for sure. But the argument that he tries to make, and I mean, personally, I think it's not super well supported. Partly because he doesn't, actually provide any references or data or anything. But that we've produced this kind of culture and this logic that businesses can only operate in a certain way, and that this is supported by lobbying and by collusion with the government, so that maybe he would go as far to say that I don't know. He never said it, but like you would expect him to kind of articulate how a current capitalist class would attack this idea of a workplace democracy, or try to undermine it or destroy it, right? But he doesn't really.
Well, you're getting at a very good point, though, which is that it would be against the interest of CEOs to do this, because why would they give away their property to people who, it's not their property? Why would they just give away their stuff for free, right?
Yeah.
So we're coming back to an earlier point, which is, okay, so if this is a system, if this WSDE thing can't happen autonomously, because why would people give away their property? What is the implication there? That we have to take the property away from them with force. Otherwise, it's not possible. We always come back to totalitarianism with this. There's no other way.
I don't know. I mean, I think his suggestion in words is not nearly that strong. His solution doesn't go any further than doing. I mean, it's a criticism I have of the book, but his solution doesn't go any further than implementing the same kind of state capitalist benefits that benefit the existing capitalist class, right? So the things that he says are, we have to have laws that support, support certain things that are necessary for this kind of business to exist. We have to introduce agencies that can, he talks about job enterprises and stuff. And
that's the thing. He doesn't have any plan how to get there. But I don't think that works to his credit.
No,
I mean, that just
his plan is to introduce policy and introduce education and these different mechanisms to try and make it more force. To try and incentivize people to start doing these kinds of businesses, right?
Yeah, but by basically using government force to outlaw private property. Is that not where we're going with this?
I don't think he's saying to outlaw private property. I think he's saying he wants to give. He talks about tax incentives, right? If you have one of these companies, you will have some certain kind of tax incentive to do so. It's you're not having anything.
Okay.
He never advocates for seizing property.
No, he does. We're gonna get to that. Okay. He definitely does. But that's in the very end of the book. So we'll just put that aside and we'll get to there.
Sure.
Okay. So let's maybe skip away with the intro. Okay, let's read just another quote. The state would become dependent for its revenues, operation, and very existence on receiving distributions of portions of the surpluses from the self-directed workers themselves. So I think this is explaining how the government would be financed in this WSDE system. And
Yeah.
I think the wording here is super telling about how he views this whole issue. The state would become dependent for its revenues, operation, and very existence on receiving distributions of proportions of the surpluses from the self-directed workers themselves. So, in his view, taxes are not something that the state takes by force. There are charitable donations that the state receives
Okay.
from companies. And there's a lot of this kind of wording throughout the whole book. I think there are parts where it's even more clear. But, I mean, obviously Richard Wolff isn't that naive to think that taxes are like voluntary donations, right? Sure. Which again just does not speak to his character. Like if he wants to like use force to take stuff away from people, then like simply by making it obfuse and wording it like, you know, receiving donations and shit like that, that's that's just shady, dude.
But you know, he's never like criticized taxation.
Certainly not. But in the way he argues for more taxation and stuff like that, he never comes out and says we're going to take it. It's always just like, yeah, the state would rely on receiving distributions. You know, that's how he puts it. And it's like, yeah, okay.
It's definitely hard to imagine like what his ideal composition of government would look like, but it's also hard. I mean, it's a short book as well, and like the role of government. He talks about it, but like it's always from the perspective of these companies, these like worker self-directed enterprises, and it kind of gives the impression of a government that doesn't actually do a whole lot, if that makes sense. Like,
right,
more than maybe it does, aside from like the, you know, creating these like. I mean, he gives us idea of like a central planning solution and for like labor as well, right? For distributing labor. But yeah, I don't know. I think I find it hard to really. Maybe I would benefit from going through the last chapter again, but like,
yeah,
it's hard to really. I definitely see what you're saying, 100%.
Well, okay. So just to do a bit more on page 17, it says a reorganization of workplaces coupled with the institutionalization of democratic co-determination would effectively end capitalism. The state would thus become dependent for its revenues, blah, 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 distributions. In this way, we could establish the material basis for the eventual withering away of the state that any Marxist envisages. So the problem, like, he doesn't say it explicitly, and again, I don't think this works in his favor that he doesn't do this, but essentially this is Leninism.
Yeah.
He advocates for the institutionalization. So, I mean, through the state. So, this is just using, I don't know how you're going to get away with not just saying that this is using state force.
Right.
But to implement democratic co-determination. So, to translate that means taking, like, basically outlawing private property from the owners of the company to institutionalize democratic co-determination, so basically to give everyone an equal share of the company by force, to effectively outlaw capitalism.
Yeah.
And then and then eventually this whole Marxist dream of the state withering away, where we all eat grapes and shit, will maybe come in the future. And this is exactly like Emma Goldman coming to the Soviet Union and criticizing Lenin for there not being any freedom of speech. And Lenin says freedom of speech is a luxury that we can afford maybe once the revolution is over, and you know this we're going to approach this Marxist utopia. But right now we need to implement.
Yeah. It's
So it's like,
the means justify the ends, or the ends justify the means.
yeah. So it's all worded very, very softly, and I think that's very purposely so.
And I will also say as well, like the withering of the state language as well, like specifically that term, like I don't know. I've never felt super convinced of, and in all fairness, like I haven't like read very deeply into like a lot of, I guess, like the classic leftist literature aside from Marx, but like this idea of like the word the term like withering of the state is like so classic, like Lenin, right? And like I don't know why you would feel you would need to use that specific word. It feels like a kind of dog whistle in a way. And I mean also as well, it's like, okay, let's talk about that then. How does implementing more things through the state enable the state to go away?
Exactly.
Like, I think that's like, I don't know, maybe I'm stupid. Maybe I need to read more, but like that's like an essential question for me.
Yes, and then he kind of just washes that whole debate away by later saying, but actually, whether it's central planning or free markets, that doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
I don't know. So yeah, he also calls to replace the drive for profit and accumulation in investment, which is like, okay, if you replace that, then like, what is the incentive for innovation and new business ideas? Like,
well, he says that like workers would be incentivized to do that because it would profit them immediately, right?
But would they though? I mean, like, seriously, if you are like, if you are one of tens of thousands of employees in like a big car company, I mean, are you really incentivized to like spend a lot of your day's time on innovating like a new engine idea?
But if you think about it in this way, like, because the whole, like criticism of this like productivity and efficiency and stuff is that, it doesn't actually save people any time, and they end up having to do the same job or even more work in the same time just because some things have become quicker, right?
Can you elaborate there? I didn't understand.
So, for example, if we're talking about like a car company, we produce 10 cars a day.
Sure.
If we and it takes us 8 hours to do it, the whole team of 100 people or whatever. But we find a way to produce 15 cars a day using some new technology. We either have I think what Wolff assumes or argues is that this enhanced productivity doesn't benefit the worker because they have to work probably the same amount of time every day. It might be less demanding physically. They might not be like hammering things together, but they don't necessarily see a return in their wage through being more productive.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But if you were in a self-determined, self-directed enterprise, you would have the decision of, do we want to earn more money individually and produce 15 cars a day, or do we want to stay at our pace and only work 4 hours a day instead of 8? Like you would be able to make that decision yourself, or as a collective.
Right, but that's the whole point. That in the former case, as you said, the worker might not be like, they're still going to work 8 hours a day regardless of this new technology.
Yeah.
But so those like 10 workers are not going to feel the benefits as much, but all the other, I don't know, how many are we? 8 billion people on the planet.
Yeah.
All of them are going to get, like every single consumer on the planet is going to get the benefit. So in this like thing where the workers decide or not decide to advance technology or not, because it doesn't really change their working day, innovation just stops, and we're just not going to get better products. We're not going to get new medicines. Like, there's no incentive to innovate anymore.
Well, there would be, because you would be selling 5 more cars per day. You would earn 50% more income every day.
But the new technology is not just something you stumble upon. It's something that you have to put a lot of resources
Sure.
and time into, and it's just.
But I think
it's not
he would
clear to me
argue
that a board.
I think he would argue that
workers would.
the workers would be able to determine how much goes into that, and the consequences of how good their research and development is would be represented in how good their end product would be.
But new technology and new ideas are never, and this is a very fountainhead thing to say, but they're never like invented collectively. It's always a single person who invents something, and if they don't have the patent rights and the the legal foundation to 100 capitalize on their idea, why would they spend 10, 20 years of their life in complete like economic, so like every entrepreneur story ever, like they were poor for many, many years. They believed in this idea. They ate like the shittiest food, but they wouldn't give up because they just believed in this idea and the dream, and they finally made it, and then they made it big, and then they get to keep the fruits of their labor. But if they don't get to keep it, why the fuck would they would take the risk to live in poverty for 10 years to begin with? Like, I don't know. I think innovation, even if it doesn't completely stop, like for individual people who invent things and have ideas, there's no reason to take on a big risk to like believe in this idea if you can't capitalize on it in the end.
Well, there would be no reason for there would definitely be no reason for like an inventor to sell their thing or to introduce their idea to a self-directed enterprise if they wanted to continue to make money off the thing that they invented, for sure.
Right, yeah. So if the whole system is set up in this way where you cannot be 100% of the company owner,
right,
or own your own stock, then again, Richard Wolff never comes out and says this, but in that system, there's definitely less of an incentive to innovate. Right?
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay, but that's beside the point, I guess.
No, I think that's really relevant actually, because he doesn't address that, and yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think we still see today, even in huge companies like Apple and Google and whatever, that they do innovate a huge amount internally, right? They have huge R&D teams that do produce innovation. Like, I don't know if the people in those teams are necessarily, I don't know, like talking about like individual entrepreneurs is definitely one thing, and I can totally see what you're saying. Like, there's no incentive for an individual entrepreneur who's making some new technology or some new product to sell that to, or to, unless they did want to get rid of it, there's no incentive for them to like give that to a company for which they will have no control or no ownership over it. But if you work for like a company like Apple, for example, all of the decisions, whether it's like the software or the hardware or whatever, are developed by people who we will never know the names of, and that seems to be fine. Maybe it would be, I don't know.
I mean, they get paid a lot, so.
They get paid a lot, sure.
I don't know. I guess the point is that if they, like, in the SED whatever world, we would probably still have the post office, but we certainly wouldn't have Tesla or SpaceX or anything like that, so. Or Microsoft, probably. I don't know.
Yeah, Fair
I mean,
enough.
we could take those systems, we could take those companies over and run them probably, but they wouldn't be invented in the first place. I think that's quite or they would be less likely to be invented. Okay, sorry.
That's okay. I mean, I think that's a like good point to discuss.
And another point we come back a lot is the Great Depression. And he's a big fan of FDR, and he says FDR's model of federal job creation, for example, could be modified to provide specifically for the unemployed to regain work within self-directed enterprises. So first of all, this is just like literally state socialism, right? So we employ people via government taxes to like make government jobs. Okay. The second thing is, you're going to take the most incompetent and unwilling people, the unemployed.
Say that again. Sorry, you broke up.
Sorry. You're gonna take the unemployed. So and I'm like not dissing on you if you're unemployed, but like just by definition, you're gonna take the most incompetent and unwilling people, put them in the most dysfunctional working condition, subsidize it, and then somehow this is not gonna burden the debt, the government debt. Like the math is not mathing right now.
I was unemployed until 2 days ago. I take offense to that.
That's fine. I was unemployed for a while too, but the fact of the matter is that, like, I don't know, like, he has this whole thing about, like, not increasing government debt and Keynesianism bad, but also we should definitely just have unemployed on, like, federal job programs.
Right.
I was like, what?
Yeah, I don't know.
So he never addresses how that's gonna square out. It's just like said.
Well, I think he acknowledges that, like, in the conclusion that, like, you know, it's not like a necessarily, even though it's annoying because he uses the word utopia a lot throughout the book, but then in the end he's like, this isn't a utopian solution. This is just a better thing than what we currently have.
Sure, but it's not though.
Well, I mean that aside, like,
yeah.
What was my point? I can't remember. I lost my point. Anyway, on that point, though, that you were making about, like, this idea of, like, staff and you know, having, like, some federal job thing. He also talks about this, like, idea of rotation of staff a lot, and he kind of leaves it open. He talks about, you know, we could. He seems to be pretty against specialization, like, or like over specialization, and
the old whole division of labor,
which is very, like, Marx based. You know, looking at the social consequences of the division of labor, and opts instead for, or suggests that, like, a solution where people are kind of rotated around a business or rotated around a certain specialism. Would be,
the Japanese model.
Yeah. And this is exactly what I thought about. It's like Japan. Typical corporate structure in Japan is that many like university graduates will apply to a company rather than a specific post within the company, and their position within that company is determined by, to a large degree, by their employers. And, you know, there is, like, some leeway to kind of choose your own career path and do specific exams to go to different positions, but once you're in, you know, you might end up working in many different areas of the company, and in many different areas of the country as well, and even abroad too. And whilst I appreciate what he's going for about, I do think it can be beneficial to have general experience of the working of a company, and especially when you think about the ways that, for example, like, you know, I worked as a cook for a long time, and, like, one of the perennial difficulties in a kitchen is working with the front of house staff, like the waiters, the wait staff, and it's, I think a huge part of it is that there's a very little, like, understanding of the roles of each other, and a very different level of responsibility between people, and people who have worked in both areas tend to be able to kind of work in that environment much better, I think. But I don't know if it's like we can scale that up however you want, right? If you want to try that, then go ahead. But I think it kind of undermines the idea of having skill in any kind of field, right? And especially if we're talking about the idea of productivity. And of course, he's not like, productivity is a part of what he's talking about, but I feel like it's not like the complete central thing. But
and on this whole thing of the rotation Japanese versus the Western model, I would also say that the appeal of the Japanese model, of the rotation model, is that you get to experience many different areas and get broader experiences. But I think expectation versus reality has a huge dissonance here, where it's actually in the Western model where people frequently change jobs, frequently change companies, and experience many different things. And in the Japanese model, where you're stuck with one company for a long time and you have very little say over what you're actually going to do.
Yeah, which is the opposite of like real freedom over your own labor, I think.
Yeah.
And as well, I think, people point to that as like one of the reasons for like Japan's lack of innovation and stuff as well. And, I don't know a huge amount about that, so I can't really say, but like it feels like intuitive that wouldn't, specializing would be the way of getting deeper into your field, and the more people you have working deeper in their fields, the further you can find new things that are useful and valuable. And I also, as well, another thing, I was thinking a lot about, like, what was his name? I meant to fucking Google this before I called you. I can talk about something else in the meantime. We have a dorm on our old university campus called Keiteki dorm. And it's significant because it's one of the only self-directed university dorms in Japan. There are only really only like a handful. I think that the biggest one is Kyoto University's. And so it's significant. It's interesting because, the dorm is entirely run by a student council and by the people that live there. And they have like full, democratic control over how the place is run. And they negotiate with the university.
And both that dorm and the Kyoto one are nationally known for being extraordinarily filthy and unsafe.
Well, before that's definitely true, but another thing about this. So I was considering doing like a project on this, and kind of. So I spoke to a couple of people that lived there, and most people that lived there either hated the fact that they either hated it, like just hated the dorm purely because it was filthy and it was, it is like the Wild West. If you ever get the chance to see the place, it is like.
I think it's actually quite similar to my current Tokyo University dorm.
But also, very like the participation rate in any of the decisions is super low, and it's been in constant decline.
Absolutely.
And maybe Wolff would claim that this is part of this ideology of the times, this like where maybe people don't have the time to think about it, or I guess in the case of this dorm, it is only kind of a halfway house that people live in for a few years. But it does kind of, it was interesting to me because, I read a lot about this dorm, and I was really excited about this idea of like the self-determined place. And I think there are people that do enjoy living in that kind of place, but, when we're thinking about our whole society, a society as a whole, and everyone that lives here, how many people would actually be more satisfied and happy and fulfilled in that situation than, being in a job which they don't have to think about how the company is run. This is another reason why I think the slavery comparison was like super, just like, I don't know. I just think it was like, I don't know.
Well,
Very, like,
the comparison just ignores the fact that the slaves aren't there voluntarily.
exactly.
That's kind of the point.
he does acknowledge that, like, you enter into a contract with your employer when you get employed, and like, I get it, like, it's very hard to find a job that is very satisfying. It's very hard to find a job where sometimes you don't feel like you're in a situation where you should be paid a little bit more for what you do, and obviously, being in antagonism with your employer. And that power balance is obviously it exists, but, like, it's nothing to compare to literally being forcibly removed from where you live, transported overseas thousands of miles to labor for no financial compensation and no personal freedom.
And also, I find that the power balance in any jobs, and the current one I have is like very, very like Japanese rigid company structure, but
Yeah.
out of all the jobs I've had so far, the power balance in my relationship to the employer, there has always been more empathy and more freedom than in your student status at a university.
Right.
Where it's a very direct, like, we are the council, we have absolute power over you, and you better eat shit and grovel.
Yeah.
Which is never the case in a company, unless, like, at least not in my experience,
Yeah. So, whilst I I'm personally, I am excited about this idea of workplace democracy, or like
I'm not.
at least, like, on a personal level, one thing that I think is, I don't know. One thing that I find appealing about it is the idea of their. Okay, this is one thing I think that actually my idea of workplace democracy differed from his, because he talked about like work, all these like specific terms that basically sound the same, like the difference between a co-op, worker managed or worker owned, and I think mine probably sits more with worker owned. Because he's against this idea of, like, hiring managers externally or hiring a board externally, which in my view would be, dissolvable into this idea of like a, democratic workplace, right? Like, can you if we're talking about this idea of freedom within your workplace, right? If you are unable to outsource the management of a business to some third party,
I don't think he's against that.
I think
he says that that's no. I think that he says that that's totally an option they could do.
But I think he makes this distinction between that and worker owned workplaces. Let's see if I can try and find it.
I think he says the workers can own the business. They can be the shareholders, but they can still hire managers. And in fact, that's probably what they would do.
I think that was what he was. I think that was a distinction that he was making against his idea, right? He was talking about.
I don't think so, but we can get to that.
Sure. Either way, I mean, I would be, I would be open much more to this idea of being like, okay, we're a bunch of guys, like, we're together, we're doing this thing. Let's get someone in who is separate from the company, who we can, come in as like a contract worker who can manage us, or come in as a consultant or whatever. That seems fine to me. Obviously, like, I don't feel comfortable with this idea of, like, legislating that these kinds of business be necessary, but it's like yeah, I don't know.
Well, Richard Wolff was very comfortable with it. But yeah, just on that last point about like democracy in the workplace and like the FDR program where you have the unemployed now get like capital, and now they're gonna build a WSDE or whatever
yeah,
with like government subsidies. I mean, Jesus, dude, like not even looking at the national scale, where I think the democratic dialogue and the candidates that we end up having are a fucking joke. But even on like a like very small group level, like in like high school or whatever, or even university, are democratic structures actually perfect oases of equality among all participants, or are they basically popularity contests where the ruling class misappropriates funds for their in-group?
Right.
Like it's clearly the latter in every instance ever.
Yeah.
Like democracy works maybe in like a family structure where it's like 2-3 people that you love a lot, but everything. The bigger it gets, the like more, the idea that in like a, I don't know, Ford Motor Company,
Mm-hmm.
that the janitor actually has like a legitimate say in like what to produce, even if there's like a WSDE structure,
Yeah.
which Richard Wolff says is probably going to be parliamentary, which means going to have elections every other year.
Yeah, right.
And then basically the ruling class is gonna rule.
Yeah.
I don't know, and like the idea that the unemployed of all people are gonna do this debate, I don't know.
So
it just seems very silly.
yeah, and this reminded me of so I found the paper that was wanted to talk about the Arishima Takashi, who was I think he was a author. He was an author, yeah. And he was a Japanese author who was inherited I think it was his uncle's farm in Hokkaido, and he was an anarchist, and he decided to liberate the tenant farmers, dissolved this farm, and made it a cooperative. And you can visit it in Hokkaido even today. There's like a kind of center there, and I went there last year. It was kind of cool. And it's all the same kind of ideas. We want to eliminate hierarchy, or unjust hierarchy. We want everyone to have a say. And the paper, maybe I'll try and like remember to link it in the description. It's called Ordinary Farmers Living Anarchist Time, Arishima Cooperative Farm in Hokkaido, 1922 to 1935, by Sho Konishi. And it was published in Oxford. And I mean, the article is more just kind of, to be honest, it feels more of a slight kind of history of this. But what was interesting about it is it talks about like, the moment where these workers realized like, oh shit, now we're responsible. Now we don't have anyone who can take the responsibility for this place other than ourselves. And I think it was maybe, I don't remember exactly how many people, but it was not a huge place, maybe like 100 people or so. And, their families lived there. And this is, 1922. And they describe the author describes the discussions that they would have, when it comes to enacting decisions on the farm, like how would they do this? And it basically ended up, I think every week or every few weeks or every month, they had a discussion where they would raise any important things, any important issues. And the thing would go on all night, like they would be shouting at each other all night, trying to resolve these solutions. And a solution which would have been, arrived at from a authority now had to be resolved with everyone. And there maybe in a farm of 100 people this could work, And but this is the whole difference between representative and direct democracy, right? Direct democracy
Especially
is just
also
like
because,
it's so intensive, it takes so much effort and so
yeah,
much time and human time as well. It's not like you can't outsource this, right? You either have people that
yeah,
don't give a fuck and just lose interest and become disillusioned with this whole process, or you have to all endure these big, huge conversations and have to be interested and involved.
yeah, and like this maybe work in like a farming local environment where people are there, they're localized, they live there, their communities there and everything. But the idea that in a like big IT company or a car
Right,
company,
right.
like you're gonna tell a worker that additional to his work, he's now gonna have an additional like 4 hour of democratic meetings
Yeah,
every
yeah.
day,
I mean, this is
where they're
this
like,
is my girlfriend.
like this is literally the nightmare of, yeah, this is the nightmare of every single like big company worker, is to have like meetings where everyone fucking has their fucking say, and you have to listen to every single moron vent their emotions.
Yeah,
Like that, immediately people are gonna quit immediately.
and also as well, like when it comes to realizing these solutions and actually feeling them, like how at least I think in practice, like I feel like a lot of the people in these situations feel like they're not actually like really getting anywhere.
Yeah,
Like I don't know, I guess because I was like student rep in our program, and it was a small
yeah,
thing, right? It was like once every 6 months we'd collect every year group would collect everyone's comments and stuff, and we'd all bring it together and we'd all like talk about these things. And
mm.
like the first thing first, it's like it's very hard to. I mean, this was representative, so it's slightly different, but um, you know, I took everyone's opinions and I tried to present them in a way that would make sense. But
Mm.
some of the comments that I got were just like, I don't know what I can do with this. Like, like,
Yeah, yeah,
and sometimes people would come, I'd bring people along who had specific concerns, and they'd speak in front of the rest of the university staff, the faculty, and
mm.
I mean,
The filth.
it's like they're all the staff are also they also don't want to be there,
Yeah,
and
of course.
at the end of the day, it's like they just say, "I'm very sorry that you feel this way, but we can't do anything because of these certain rules and these certain things." And I mean, I guess in my situation, we are dealing with a group within a higher institution, this university, and there are obviously like limits to how much power can
Yeah,
be exercised. But at the same time, it's like you have to say no to some people, and some things will be considered unreasonable. And
yeah,
will those people who have those complaints, whether valid or not, will they be satisfied when they are told no? When in the
yeah. I
beginning they're
mean,
told, you have a voice here, you can do what you want, you can say what you want, we can try and find a way of making this thing work. And I don't know. I'm not saying that like the best solution is necessarily to have like some um, you know, authority that you have no control over who decides, you know, without your say at all. But I do think that, this idea of perfect democracy in the workplace might be far more disappointing than a reader of this book might like come out thinking.
yeah.
Like I
The solution, by the way, is private property. But aside from that, now the point that you're getting at is a very good one, which is that the democracy, even direct democracy, hasn't have to scale to the national level to feel incredibly frustrating,
right.
and that your own input has no meaning. I mean, even if you think 3 people in a room and 2 decide they're going to take the other guy's stuff and fuck him, like, the guy can be, oh, well, I'm glad I got direct democracy. It's like as long as you're in the minority, you will get absolutely fucked.
Yeah,
And that is the design of democracy. That's the whole point. Is that the majority fucks the minority,
yeah,
and so that like the idea just because now in a company you have like hundreds of employees, the idea that like everyone's gonna get their grievance heard. Like, yeah, it's gonna be a meeting where no one's gonna be there. You're gonna say your part, and then okay, next. Like that's gonna.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
um. Okay. Anything else on that? Because I'm on page 18 in my notes, and there's 250 in
Oh,
my
Jesus.
thing.
I guess it's not connected. What was I going to say? Um, I wanted to talk about this idea of, because I think we'd spoken about this before with like anarcho-syndicalism, which is not, I don't think is very different,
Oh.
or at least there are some differences, I guess. But I was like, curious about this idea of like, you know, I guess instead of, maybe it's not like as a perfect replacement of government, but this
Mm.
idea of having syndicates for industry, for business or whatever, which had this like, which were kind of like these different democratic nodes within society, where people were free to kind of decide the conditions of how they worked and decide within the context of other syndicates, like how society would operate. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and like I guess I haven't like given this a huge amount. I also haven't gone over my notes of this because I didn't have time, but that I've written before. But I think one of the things that I ended up doubting about this idea was that like what what would prevent like huge concentrations of power in specific syndicates and specific um, organizations. And I think we talked about like the idea of, like like guilds and stuff like
Mm.
that gain a disproportionate amount of power in society and can also create be gatekeepers and create inequality in different ways. So like I think we talked about China, but I can't remember exactly. I don't know if you remember the
I don't know how
conversation.
you're linking this back to Richard Wolff right now.
No, no. The reason I bring it up is because he's talking about this like this idea of all these like different organizations, and this idea that this is supposed to reduce inequality, right? We have like if you're able to exercise democracy in a business, this will lead to equality throughout the whole of society. But
Mm-hmm.
I think his solution here is to use government
Mm-hmm.
to prevent inequality. Essentially, I think that's probably a solution here. But what is, for example, how would Richard Wolff um, dissolve this? If there's a really really successful worker co-op and they decide, oh, we want everyone who works here to be millionaires because we're making so much money and we're doing this like producing this thing, and then there's this other cooperative which might be in competition or might be making something different, which is not nearly as profitable, but um, you know is prevented from accessing the same. For example, like I guess he probably resolves this with like the like worker federation thing and the idea of like the government allocating people around different companies. But if it wasn't for some kind of system like that, which is you know already contradicts his claim that is impossible to successfully like um, make like economic predictions. He talks about like I'm getting all mixed up. Anyway,
I
I'm just
have
trying
no
to try and
idea
say
what you're
this.
saying.
I was doing so well. I'm going to try and say this simply. Um, can I go from my shithole, like, tiny, we make pens worker cooperative to working at, like, the Apple cooperative, which makes so much more money and maybe would provide me with a bigger salary. If there's no, like, state...
Upward social mobility?
Yeah, or no, if there's no state-mandated, like, higher and lower salary, he does talk about salary limits, but I think he only talks about it in terms of specific companies. How would I be prevented from doing that? Would I be prevented from doing that? Would I, and if I was so shit at my job, like, would I still be allowed to stay there? And because if it were the case that there was competition between these companies, you would produce inequality, right? There would be people and companies that were more productive than others. And if you wanted to work at a more productive company, you would have to exhibit your ability to maintain that company's productivity or even improve it. And if you couldn't do that, you wouldn't get hired, right?
Yeah.
So you could have this same situation where you have this workplace democracy within these systems, within these different companies, but there would just be companies where the rich people work and companies that the poor people work. Unless
I think
you had this
it's hard to get rid of meritocracy.
And unless you had this, like, he does talk about wage cuts and stuff, but he does only talk about that within the companies, as far as I read, at least. I don't know. That was, like, my point with, like, anarcho-syndicalism, was kind of like, if that was your goal, then if your goal was to reduce inequality, that would probably do the opposite, and it would probably make things much worse than they are now.
I think I see what you're going.
You could say the same with university, right? With our universities, like, some universities, they attract companies for graduates will have better opportunities in higher paying companies. And it's purely because you've just gone to a school that apparently has a better education.
Yeah, or I guess the entrance exam is more severe.
Yeah.
Like that. Fair point. Well, I think we really need to get back to the text.
Yes.
Because I'm still on the FDR job program from page 18. And so he elaborates this job program thing and then continues on by saying, in such programs, government would provide subsidies, incentives, and technical support to particular kinds of enterprises because markets dominated by capitalist enterprises would otherwise destroy them. So basically, these unemployed people working in WSDEs, in capitalism, they wouldn't survive at the market rate, at market pricing. They wouldn't be productive enough to survive in the free market.
Right.
So therefore, we have to prop them up by government subsidies. But how, this is again now going against the whole point of being more productive, and like, if you're gonna artificially pump taxpayer money into businesses that are so unprofitable they couldn't survive in a free enterprise system, you're now gonna just increase poverty, like starving people. Like, this is impoverishing the nation. Like, is he grappling with this? I don't understand.
Right.
Like, you can't. If something's so unprofitable it can't exist in the free market and you're going to subsidize it, I just don't see how this connects to, like, being more productive.
Well, yeah, if he talks about, like, productivity, and, like, he suggests that it might be more productive. In the case that it isn't, I think he believes that it would provide social benefits, in that people would be able to decide what was a comfortable life for them. But again, if this doesn't work, and if people don't actually feel the benefit of being in this kind of thing, and if people aren't happy with work becoming a huge part of their life that they have to worry about and vote on, and that involves the whole family, and that's without even talking about what you were saying earlier with like if you're just like a remote worker like lives in another country, like why do you give a fuck?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like what do you do?
Nothing. Okay, moving on.
Yes.
The page 26, we have the idea, this is very Marxian, of managers as, quote, unproductive workers. Now, later on in the book, he would say that they're enablers,
Yeah.
but at this time he doesn't say it, which I was just like, okay, so we're just going to go this whole Marx thing now, eh? And that he says that colleges and universities discriminate against critics of capitalism. I mean, that could just not be any further from the truth. Like, academics are, and this is if you look at any of Jonathan Haidt's work, are so extremely dominated by hard leftists. And even if they weren't, the idea that we should publicly subsidize all opinions is completely laughable.
Right.
Like, it's the same thing. It's like I think in Florida there's something going on now with like quote unquote banning books or something, but a government school is funded by taxes, which, and you know me, I don't even agree with this, but it's funded by taxes to teach very specific things. So the idea that you get upset if they don't teach every single thing, or like, another thing that it's not in the curriculum. I how is this even an argument? Like,
yeah, for sure.
Okay. Moving on. Quote, by contrast, in 2011, the Occupy Wall Street movement broke with the traditional taboo, clearly affirming the legitimacy of criticizing capitalism itself. But again, I would say that the big, they're criticizing mostly cronyism, whereas the big capitalists, Peter Schiff and so on, the big free enterprise guys, they were in a lot of ways in agreement with Occupy Wall Street,
right?
Because they're against bailouts.
Yeah,
that was the big thing. They don't want the government to intervene. And so this is just never mentioned in this entire book, which I think is just so dishonest. Yeah. Moving on, quote, big businesses subordinate smaller capitalists when it did not overtake them. So big business subordinated smaller capitalists when it did not overtake them. So I thought, okay, so let's look at the biggest instance of that in the last couple of years, which is lockdowns, which destroyed small businesses in favor of big businesses, mostly Amazon and so on. I mean, Amazon made an absolute killing during COVID, and many small businesses went bankrupt, obviously. And so I have a YouTube video linked here in my notes. I'll send you that, and maybe you can put it in the pod. And you'll see Richard Wolff on his YouTube channel saying that the conflict between lockdowns and, quote, personal freedom is, quote, 100% phony. Fuck your personal freedoms. He endorses lockdowns 100% and says they worked everywhere, and even in Sweden, and only the United States sucks.
Right.
Which is such like, I mean, can you come out as any like bigger champion for Amazon and big business against small enterprise? Like all throughout the country, the small enterprises were campaigning against lockdowns because obviously, right? The government tells you to shut down your business. And if you're a small business, you can't just afford to go completely into the red for a couple months, whereas Amazon can afford it. Or in fact,
benefit
even if they benefit even, but even if they didn't benefit, they could afford it, right? It's a very common strategy to lower prices below the market rate to flush out all the smaller businesses.
And that's exactly what they've always done. Like they weren't profitable for. It was like a decade or something into their business that they weren't profitable.
Exactly. And so that Richard Wolff, then, he says this in his book, but, I just, before I even looked up this video, I just knew that there's absolutely no way that this guy actually sticks to his principles and is not swept into, like, this whole, like, groupism shit where, like, because he's a socialist, he has to also be pro lockdowns, obviously. Like, there's no way
Right.
Richard Wolff is going to, on his channel, be like, oh, but we have to protect the small businesses against big businesses. No, no way.
Right.
And obviously he didn't. So, yeah. Side point. He says, this, in respect to this big businesses supplanting smaller ones, this has always been the case since capitalism replaced feudalism in Europe and expanded globally from there. Which, I don't, what is the implication there? That the economy was better in feudalism? And, like, I don't know. Obviously the more like free market take, what shit only got really bad after central banks decoupled from the gold standard. And this is a whole big. I don't know if you read the additional reading I sent you.
No, I didn't have time for it.
Okay, we're gonna have to make time for that after a little break, because I think that is gonna defuse this whole thing. On page 30 he says, in the United States, every president who presided over a cyclical downturn promised that his economic interventions, his mix of monetary and fiscal policies, would not only end that downturn, but would ensure that we would not have another one in the future. No politician or set of policies in the history of capitalism, however, has yet delivered on that promise. And so, yes, to his credit, yes, the problem is intervention. Intervention does not fix it. We agree. Okay. Next quote. Capitalism also develops unevenly across space and always has. Thus, the growth of wealth in some parts of the world goes hand in hand with the growth of poverty in others. This is just plain false, and like so incredibly false. Capitalism has never resulted in the growth of poverty anywhere ever. And to the degree that markets are freer, people have always been wealthier, and there's not a single case in human history that this has not been the case. Between 2000 and 2010, the world poverty rate literally halved. A lot of that is due to India and Africa adopting more free market policies. So this whole like first world countries exploiting third world, it's just so completely anti any data that exists. But it's just like a thing that's parroted constantly by these people, and so it goes unchecked. I don't know. Well, it just frustrates me.
Cause he talks about it's like this a semantic slip. Like he talks about inequality. It's like what is it? Like relative versus absolute poverty.
But he just says the growth of poverty.
No. I know, and that's what I'm saying. It's like, if you want to talk about rich people getting richer, and a wealth gap becoming more extreme, that's one thing. But to talk about people actively becoming less wealthy because they are working as part of the system, I mean, it's a very different claim.
It's just plain false. I'm sorry. Yeah. I don't even what to quote. Since capitalism's instability and unevenness are continually reproduced across every variation of external, natural, political, and cultural conditions, some of those who defend the system have felt compelled to find better arguments that don't rely on external causes. So I think he's referencing here by external causes that he's claiming that capitalists blame the business cycle, on like external causes, like the workers aren't. This is perfect. And he's actually right in some extent, because Keynes fucking does this. All the Keynesians say that basically a depression or recession or whatever you want to call it is because the public doesn't spend enough. There is a lack of aggregate demand. So in this sense, he's actually, I would actually agree with Wolff that, Keynesians totally do this. They blame economic recessions on the public not spending enough money. So government has to step in and increase aggregate demand. But I mean, people on the actual like hardcore capitalist Austrian side don't agree with this. Yeah, I think we have to talk about the business cycle, because the claim in this book is definitely that capitalism has an endemic business cycle, and this is the same claim as Keynes has, essentially. Although Richard Wolff doesn't say where it comes from,
Hmm.
that it's just capitalism just has this. It just is, and it's always going to be, and free markets just have ups and downs, and that the only way to fix this is to move beyond capitalism.
Yeah. So, I think this is a pretty decent place to leave things for the time being. We're going to come back to this next time.
Yeah, we
And
need to talk about the business cycle because it's really
yeah,
at the core of this, of Richard Wolff's criticism of capitalism. And we're going to talk about why, or I'm going to present an argument for why the business cycle is not actually endemic to capitalism and it's all government's fault.
okay. Yes, sounds good. And so if you want to tune in for next time, please do.
Bye!
Bye.
Boys, 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 boys.